established in 2017 and have produced over 170 reports thus far. Our priority research areas cover 6 around criminal justice reform, poverty and the safety net, labor and employment, health and homelessness, and today we'll be going over financial health and migration work specifically. So I used to be with Team Banta for a long time in the third house, but excited to be here with CPL now to strengthen evidence-based policymaking in the Capitol. Today we're joined by our esteemed moderator and panelists. We have our moderator, Lindsey Holden from POLITICO, Teri Olle from Economic Security California Action, and Chaz Alamo with the Legislative Analyst Office, or LAO. We also have our executive director at our UC Berkeley site, Evan White, who will be presenting our research today, along with our other lead researcher, Brett, who will be here as well. Before we jump into today's presentation, on behalf of the UC Student and Policy Center, which is happy to host us today, on behalf of Director Catherine Baker, we just wanted to flag an upcoming affordability conference that will be held here on April 30th. Is that right, Vanessa? Vanessa's the event coordinator here at UC Student Policy Center. If you want to, there's an Eventbrite registration link for this event too. And again, that'll be later at this month here at the UC Student Policy Center. As you can see, they also have a great panel here as well. Former legislators, current executive secretary, Treasurer Lorena Gonzalez, state auditor, et cetera. So that'll be another great event here at UCSP. So without further ado, and to present our research today on affordability and migration, it's my pleasure to present to you all the executive director for our Berkeley site at CPL, Evan White.
Thank you, Justin. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Format, I'm going to talk for a little bit about the report, and then we're going to jump into a moderated discussion with this lovely panel. So I'll try and keep it relatively quick. This work was an extension of work that we've done on migration in the state of California, and we wanted to really look at the relationship between migration and affordability in the state, and how much those decisions to leave the state and to move really were related to financial considerations. As I'll talk about in a second, we have this excellent data source that allows us to follow the financial trajectories of movers, so to not just look at sort of who's moving, who's not, but also what their profiles are and what happens to them after they move and leave the state, or in some cases come to the state or move elsewhere in the state. And then we also just are updating a series of reports we've had on California migration overall. As Justin mentioned, this is joint work with Brett Fisher, who's here in the crowd, if you have questions for him, and I'll just launch in. So the data set that we used here, very cool data. We built this data set in 2020. It's a panel of observations from one of the 3 nationwide credit bureaus, and we essentially get the data that you would see on your own credit report without any of the sort of identifying information. So at the person level and at the loan level, we're able to see sort of what the balances of various accounts are, what the sort of how those trend over time, delinquencies, whether or not you get a new mortgage or a new credit card, things like that. And we see this for about 60 million folks around the country. We oversample folks in the great state of California. We get the data from 2004 to present on a quarterly basis. So we get it very sort of updated, and we're able to see not only your financial picture, but also where you live. Down to both the zip code and usually census tract and census block information. And then we also get some demographics about you. So a very rich data set. Sort of what's unique about it as compared to other sources of migration data like census data or IRS data is that we can follow the same people over time. So we can see them before the years that they move and then after the years that they move and see what happens to them in their financial lives. And then also the sort of detailed geographical and temporal detail is something you don't get from some of those other data sets. I was just talking with Chaz before this. The IRS migration data just came out, and it's lagged by about 3 years. So this data, it's lagged by about 3 months, right? So we get a much more up-to-date picture of what's happening with migration. So that's the data. The first section of our report deals with this affordability issue. So what we find is that people, when they make the decision to move, they are moving to much more affordable locations. So there's a story that you might think could be happening, which is that people from Los Angeles or San Francisco are choosing to move to other high-cost metros, like New York or Boston or Chicago. But in fact, what we see is that people are moving to much more affordable locations, right? So we look at this chart shows the median housing costs of the neighborhood where someone is leaving from and their destination neighborhood in another state, or if they're moving within the state of California, or if they're coming to the state of California. And what you see is that the housing costs of the neighborhoods that people are moving to out of state are about $700 cheaper than the housing costs that they see in the neighborhood that they move from. And the inverse is true for folks who are moving to California, that they see much higher housing costs in the neighborhoods that they're moving to. So, you know, about $670 a month, that's about $8,000 over the course of the year, higher housing costs that people are facing. Now, to be clear, we can't see people's actual individual housing costs. This is just the housing costs of the neighborhoods that they're moving to. The figure on the right shows the same thing, but in terms of median home values. So if someone's looking to purchase a home, the housing market that they're confronting in their new neighborhoods is about half as expensive as the one that they left in California. So that's close to $400,000 cheaper, which is like kind of a shocking statistic in my mind. And so one question that might raise for you is, well, do people end up buying a home in those new neighborhoods? And so the next thing we did was follow people over time after they moved. And that's what this chart shows. So this is a regression framework that Brett can tell you a lot more about than I can. But basically what we're doing here is trying to control for individual characteristics as well as time-related characteristics. So for controlling for things like age, as well as the tendency for people over time to just become a homeowner. So you can sort of think of this as, you know, comparing people who are leaving the state to themselves before they left, is one way of thinking about it. And what you see is from a baseline of about 22% folks who are homeowners, we see an 11 percentage point increase in their homeownership rate. In other words, their likelihood of becoming a homeowner went up by about 50% when they left the state. Now, the likelihood of becoming a homeowner if you moved within the state also went up. That's the orange line, but not by nearly as much. And if you moved to the state of California for those first 2 years, you're actually less likely to be a homeowner than you were in the other state you lived in. But then over time, you become more likely to become a homeowner. But you still see this substantial gap between folks who are living in California and folks who left the state. And so this we are able to see at the individual level, and presents pretty, we think, pretty conclusive information that people are, more likely to become a homeowner when they leave the state than if they stay in the state. The second section of the report talks about the profile of folks who are moving, and we came up with this phrase, which is that sort of on average, the folks who are leaving the state tend to be, comfortable financially, but constrained compared to their neighbors. So we didn't find that it was like the lowest income folks who were leaving the state. Rather, we found that people were tending to leave increasingly from higher income neighborhoods, but compared to their neighbors, they were financially weaker. So let me show you what that looks like in terms of the numbers. Here we sort of divvied up the neighborhoods that people were living into roughly three terciles, three groups. So lower income neighborhoods, middle income neighborhoods, higher income neighborhoods. And what you see is from the pre-pandemic period, which is 2016 to 2019, compared to the three most recent years, which is 2023 to 2025, there was a big increase in the number of in the share of out-of-state movers who were leaving from the highest income neighborhoods, so the highest 30% of neighborhoods. And because these are shares of the total number of people leaving, the number of folks or the share of folks leaving from lower income and middle income neighborhoods therefore went down. Okay, I'm going to show you the same chart, but instead of in terciles, I'm going to show you in deciles. And what you'll see is that the action is really at the top and bottom ends, right? So this is the share of the change in the share of folks leaving from the highest 10% of tracks, and these are the shares leaving from the lowest 20% of tracks, and that's what's really driving these changes in people, the income of the neighborhoods where people are leaving from. So you might think, okay, well, people are leaving from more affluent neighborhoods. That means that more affluent people are leaving the state of California. Not necessarily. Now, we can't directly observe income in the data, but we do observe a lot of things about their credit situation. And so what you can see is that compared to their neighbors, the people who are moving are financially much weaker. So we sort of, well, anyways, just to go through this, so that credit scores are 17 points lower. To me, the most striking figure was the amount of student debt was about twice as high, so $5,500 more student debt compared to their neighbors on average. Also higher debt loads in the auto and credit card markets. They were much less likely to be a homeowner, and their age, they were just younger, right? So we sort of think this paints a story that of like people living in in more affluent neighborhoods in the state of California, wanting to attain that lifestyle, but seeing that they aren't going to be able to, and then moving out of the state. We, colloquially speaking, sort of not being able to keep up with the Joneses in the neighborhoods that they would like to live in. Now, I'll just be clear, that's our narrative about what's happening in the data. You might take a different story away from these numbers, but that's what it seemed to be saying to us. So then the question is people are leaving the state of California, where are they leaving to? I'm gonna spend a little bit less time on these results, but you know, a lot of the media story focuses on Texas. I feel like everybody talks about people leaving for Texas. And certainly people are leaving for Texas. People are also leaving for a lot of other states. When you compare states on sort of an apples to apples basis, meaning controlling for the population of the states where they're moving to, what you really get a picture of is that people are leaving for the closest states. Nevada being the big outlier here, but other states like Oregon and Arizona and Idaho and things like that. So in this chart, the blue is the the blue is the number of people coming to California per 10,000 residents of the state that they're leaving from. Okay, so we get about 150 folks per 10,000 from Nevada. And we send to Nevada about 225 folks per 10,000. And then the red numbers are on net. So you can see that on net, we send more people to Nevada per 10,000 folks than any other state, followed by Idaho and then Oregon and Arizona. This is the map version of this. Actually, I have the wrong version of this on here, but you can sort of make it out anyway. So the much darker blue in the states close to California. And then as you moved eastward, the sort of blues die down a bit. Tennessee is a bit of an outlier. They get a lot more folks from California than other states on the East Coast. And then the red states are folks who are actually sending on net folks to California. During the pandemic, everything changed in terms of migration. I'm going to show that sort of the in total numbers in a second. But this is on a state-by-state basis. I don't expect you to see the small print here. But the vibe here is that during the pandemic, there were big increases, so right-hand arrows on the left-hand. So in this panel, big right-hand arrows showing big surges of folks moving from California to other states. And then after the pandemic ended, big left-hand arrows showing those subsiding. In some cases, or in many cases, back to levels that were lower than the pre-pandemic area. And then we highlighted in the report that a lot of the news media coverage of this focuses on people leaving the state of California, but we think that people should also be focused on attracting folks from other states. 42 states sent fewer people to California over the last 5 years compared to the 5 years before that. So we think that this is an area of focus that people should be looking at. And then the overall implications for California's population. This is just historically what's been happening to California's population. It grew, sort of slowed down in around 2000, and then really started to stagnate in the 2010s. And if you look at the Department of Finance's forecasts, this is my line, but it roughly is just going to stay at 40 million is what they're projecting. So, it's unlikely that California is going to grow considerably over the coming decades. In comparison, Texas and Florida's lines are roughly sort of trending upwards. And as a result, sort of we'll have less of a share of right now we're about 1 in 9 Americans live in California, and that will sort of go down a little bit over the coming decades. Breaking down domestic migration into its various components, this is what it looks like. So the red line is just the net number of people, or the net population gain or loss. And there's 3 components. One is sort of natural births and deaths, right? So births have been trending down over time and deaths have been going up over time. Our population is aging. And so that's working against California's population. The dashed blue line is international immigration, which had been fairly steady over a couple of decades, but then in the past 5 years, COVID really changed international immigration, and now Trump 2.0 is also sort of contracting the legal immigration space pretty considerably. And then our report focuses on this green dashed line, which has been negative for about 20 years, but trending, well, depends how you look at this line, but getting kind of worse over the past 20 years. And that's the one that I think, that's the one that our report focuses on. This is the overall picture of exits and entrances over the past decade. As you can see, there's sort of structurally, we have more exits than entrances, and so we're net negative, losing folks to other states. And what you can see here is that during the pandemic, there was a big bump in exits. And that was real, all the, it depends about your interpretation, but all the sort of Cal exodus, Cal exit hype, there was something to that. There was a big outflux of folks from the state during the pandemic, but we're now back to roughly pre-pandemic levels in terms of exits and entrances. Entrances actually are a little bit down from pre-pandemic levels. So we're still losing, on net, maybe 150,000 folks in 2025. So, that has to be made up for in things like births and international immigration. I'm going to save this for the comments, but there are pros and cons to California's population going stagnating. We'll talk about that in the comments, and I'll stop there. So you can reach me at this email address if you have any questions, and then Justin, who was speaking earlier, is also up there. And then this version of the slides does not have the promised pictures of us. You'll just have to remember who we are. So again, I'm going to hand the mic over to Lindsey Holden. She's a reporter at POLITICO, and she's going to moderate our discussion about this.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Yes, I am a Politico reporter. I write our Playbook PM newsletter. Everyone should sign up if they haven't already. I'm happy to talk to our esteemed panelists here. Maybe you could all just introduce yourselves really briefly, since there's like...
This one working? Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Chaz Alamo. I cover the personal income tax and migration, some economic issues at the Legislative Analyst Office here in Sacramento, which, if you don't know, is the legislature's nonpartisan budget and policy advisor.
Hey, everyone. You can hear me. I'm Teri, Olle, and I run Economic Security California. We are an issues advocacy organization working to build an economy where everyone has the freedom and stability to thrive. So I'm excited about this conversation.
Well, I kind of want to start with you, Evan. I'm a politics reporter, and obviously I feel like there's a bit of a political elephant in the room with this kind of discussion on people leaving. I feel like it's a big Republican talking point, blaming Democrats who've been in control of the state for a long time for this exodus. Can you kind of talk about the nuances of that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I get this question a lot when reporters interview me, and I think it's unfair to lay the blame at anyone's feet for this. I think the affordability crisis in California has been slow boiling for a couple decades, particularly if you look at housing's the biggest component of this. That's a 30-year, maybe 40-year problem of not building enough housing has led to the supply shortage that we have. And so I think that's the main driver of housing costs in California, and happened over the course of Republican and Democratic administrations. Certainly, the most recent administration sort of inherits that problem, and you could debate whether or not they've done enough to solve that problem. But I don't think it's fair to say that it's the result of Newsom's policies that people are leaving. We are planning to do a report that looks at the sort of political dimension of this, because we can link these data to voter records. So we hope to be able to sort of test the hypothesis of whether people are leaving, because Democratic control has led more folks who lean to the right end of the spectrum to leave the state. So we'll have some definitive say about that, hopefully in a few months. But I don't think it's fair to say, and if you look at other components of the affordability crisis, utility costs spiking over the past few years, mostly due to wildfires. Gas prices spiking over the past few months is mostly due to the Strait of Hormuz being closed. So I don't know that, you can really lay the blame at anyone's particular feet. And right now it feels to me like both sides of the aisle are really trying to address the affordability crisis, and I give them credit for that.
Gotcha. Yeah, I kind of also wanted to start off this by talking about how this will have an effect on the state. I guess if you have higher income earners leaving the state, they're taking their tax money with them. That could impact social safety net programs, et cetera. So maybe, Chaz, you could talk a little bit about the overall impact.
Happy to, sure. One of the key changes in the sort of outlook of migration for California over the last 10 years is that about 10 years ago, we were describing analytically most of the domestic net outmigration was due to outmigration among lower income households. Leading into the pandemic, and then especially during the pandemic, and a trend we're still seeing today, is that outmigration is being driven by medium and upper income households in a way that it hadn't been before. And for the state's revenue picture, this obviously has greater consequences. Using a bit more outdated data than Evan has here, data that we get from the IRS with actual tax records, we think that outmigration in the last couple years has pulled down the rate of growth for revenue by about 1 to 2%. Doesn't sound like much on its face, but the income tax for the state has grown on average 7% a year for the last 50 years. So if you imagine pulling that down 1 or 2%, it's going to have an effect structurally on state revenues. This has all been happening during a time when state revenues have been growing 10, 12, 13% a year. So it's not as though anyone's noticed, but the revenue effect is real and persistent. And I think it remains to be seen whether this trend is sort of a new equilibrium or we go back to a more static, maybe pre-pandemic trend. And we'll have to wait a bit on the IRS data incoming to know that, but it's something we're watching out for.
Gotcha. Yeah, Teri, maybe you can talk a little bit about the social safety net piece of this.
Yeah, this is reminding me of a few years ago when revenues were really hopping, and we had proposals to dramatically expand. We'd already, the governor's first year expanded the earned income tax credit quite dramatically, tripled it, set up the first young child tax credit that, of course, provided $1,000 to low-income households if you had a child under the age of 6. And then kind of in subsequent years during the pandemic, the revenues were so strong that we were going into, Department of Finance meetings and saying, actually, we should do more. We should do more. This is going to cost, hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe even billions, to expand the young child tax credit further. And they'd be like, oh, go on, tell us more, because there was so much revenue. And that actually gave some latitude to really think creatively around how we help households that aren't a part of the, a part of the growth part, and help those households in transition. And I think we are in a really different place now. And because of the requirements, of course, as a state to have to balance the we're just always constrained. And so that question of dollars in really, really impacts what we're able to do as a state to support people who aren't leaving. So I don't know if that's, yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, totally. I think another question actually that was on one of the slides that is interesting is, we're going to get into housing, but with people leaving, does that actually alleviate some of the pressure on the housing market? Maybe Chaz or Teri, one of you guys can talk about that.
On the margin, absolutely. I think one of the important considerations is, as I mentioned, this number, this may be helpful to keep in mind, 150,000, 200,000, that's sort of being the net number of people leaving the state each year. That's a relatively small share of the state's population. So in 1 year or 2 years, it's not something you might meaningfully see reflected in lower housing prices. Now, over a decade, certainly. One of the things I think this brings up is that as sort of state policymakers and thinkers in housing, we often think of this number of, like, we have a deficit of housing units, or there's some gap that we need to fill. Let's say we need 1 million more housing units than we have. And once we build those 1 million units, we can hang the mission accomplished banner and be settled. But I think one of the important things that our office has tried to work toward is that there really isn't a mission accomplished. If we build those 1 million units, yes, it will affect prices. Prices across the state will come down. But people are going to move into those that 1 million units from other parts of the country. And so you find yourself in this new equilibrium where prices maybe didn't come down as much as you expected. And I think it reflects just the sort of latent demand to live in California. You don't have to plow your driveway. You know, there are no big bugs with humidity. Everyone lives near the beach. You know, if housing was as expensive here as it is in the rest of the country, there'd be 100 million people in the state. And so I think we really have to keep in mind of that sort of existing demand elsewhere and to manage our expectations when it comes to housing supply accordingly.
Yeah, Evan, I thought it was interesting, your comments about trying to attract people here, and kind of to what Chaz is saying, in some ways the state almost sells itself in terms of like being a beautiful place to live. But you think if costs were lower, do you think that would be enough?
I mean, I think if costs went down, it would attract a lot of people to the state. I think it's always going to be more expensive to live in California because of the quality issues that Chaz, I could list a couple dozen more, but I think there are, you know, quality of life considerations that are better in California than a lot of the rest of the country. I do think, I don't know if other people have experienced this, but over the past 5 years, I would say, when I go to other states, people turn to me and they say, "You're from California? Is it as bad as it looks?" Right? Like, and this is a change from the, you know, the first 35 years of my life, where, you know, you say you're from California and people want to talk to you about the state of California. They think it's gorgeous. They're like, "Oh, is it really? Is, you know, is Yosemite really what it looks like?" You know, that sort of thing. And you know, I think there is, you know, there has been a concerted sort of campaign to make California look like an unlivable place. And I don't want to suggest that those issues aren't real, affordability being one of them, homelessness crisis, lots of things that you could mention that are sort of on that unlivability column. But I think, you know, sort of writ large, when I think about my life in California, it's not dominated by those things at all. And, you know, I have to sort of convince folks when I go to other states, like, no, it's not that bad. We have problems, but those problems exist also in the places that I'm in right now, you know, visiting you. So, you know, I think there is something to say for, you know, we need to sort of burnish our reputation a little bit when it comes to attracting entrants. You know, and that's not to downplay the very real problems that exist here, but I think that's part of what's going on here.
Yeah. Do either of you want to?
Yeah, I maybe want to like tarnish the burnish. No, I think we've discussed this obviously at length before, but I think that I don't think we should glide over the disparities and the, like, you know, as much as California, you know, whatever, fifth largest economy in the world, depending how you count it, we also have the worst poverty rates in the country, and so I think that like those tails, the way, you know, you graphed it, are really dramatic and drive a lot of the way that we think about policymaking. So, you know, and obviously I know we've spent a lot of time working on that, so that's not a critique of this report or anything. Obviously, you are deep in the weeds of understanding how complicated those problems are. But I do think that for many people in California, like, it's real that, you know, they're living, you know, they're working full time and they're still in poverty. They're paying, what, $22,000 a year for childcare, which is like more than the poverty, like more than like the, you know, poverty level for a single person. Like, that is an insane amount of money. And I think that thinking about how, you know, who's able to bear those costs and what it means when we think about the affordability crisis, it's like some of those things where those are just like locked in numbers that are very hard to, to address with any one problem, but or any one policy, but when you compound them, you end up with, with these kind of like dramatically different experiences where the lowest income households in the state of California are very low income and are really, really struggling to keep up with just basic needs. So that's where, when we're thinking about the affordability crisis, we're thinking about that piece, like how do we actually address the needs of households that are in the lowest quintile or quartile? What are the policies that we need to be looking toward to support those households so that they can continue to live here?
Gotcha. Yeah. Before we get into housing and some of the solutions, I did want to bring up telework. Obviously, is a huge part of this. Why people can leave and potentially even keep working jobs in California and other states. So, Chaz, maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about the impacts of telework.
Yeah, thanks. Our office has been paying close attention to remote work or telework, and not just in the sort of state worker context, which is a big deal here in Sacramento, but for the whole labor market. And one of the things we found that surprised us to some extent was that in the last couple of years, the share of workers who are working remotely or working hybrid has not come down very much from its pandemic peak. When I read the newspaper, I hear, every week about some new return to office mandate by a government or a large private employer. So I just assumed those numbers would be falling, but they don't seem to be. They seem to be settling in at sort of rates about 3 times their pre-pandemic levels. And this obviously has allowed many Californians to keep their remote job and move out of state. We see that in some of the data. What I think is a contribution we want to make as an office is that the trend that far outweighs those sort of Californians moving out of state with their remote job is that with remote work, California employers now have a national labor market instead of the regional labor market that maybe they had in 2017. So what we've seen is that jobs that can be done remotely have grown outside of California 3 times faster than jobs that can be done remotely have grown in California since the pandemic. We think that California employers are looking to lower cost of living locations to hire a remote worker for whom they'll have to pay 60 or 70 cents on the dollar, and they can have some cost savings that way. And it's a new labor market dynamic that the legislature is going to need to grapple with, the state's going to have to grapple with, and something we want to sort of put front of mind.
Yeah, I think perhaps the biggest part of this is housing. Obviously, states' housing costs are insane, especially compared to other states. I've been covering politics here for 4 years, and in this time, the legislature has really tried to address the supply side at least, or like spur building with streamlining, curbing environmental regulations, et cetera. Obviously, some of these have only been passed pretty recently, so we haven't really seen the effects. But I kind of did want to ask our panelists, do you feel like these pieces of legislation will have an impact on the housing market? And whoever wants.
I mean, the truth is that the legislation that has been passed over the last several years is so new that it's going to take some time to identify its effect on housing development in the state. I'll also add that much of this legislation has come online right when the Federal Reserve raised interest rates, which has really hampered the demand for housing and the production of new housing units. So it's going to be tough to disentangle those. A few years ago, our office estimated that to keep California's home prices sort of as the ratio to the rest of the country that it was in 1980, so sort of rewinding the tape, we had needed to build 100,000 units more every year than we have since 1980. That puts us at 4.5 million more units today than we would have had at the time. The legislation that we've passed certainly could affect housing supply, but I think it's difficult to imagine that it would result in that sort of unleashed supply of housing. And so, yeah, we'll see improvements, but I think we view it more on sort of the margin relative to a different landscape. I think it kind of begs the question is if home prices were more affordable in California, but the state had 60 million people instead of 40 million people, would that be unambiguously better? I don't know. I think there's a values component to that, but that's really the sort of separate two equilibrium that we and the legislature are sort of grappling with.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think another debate going on at the Capitol in recent years has been, as these developer-friendly bills have been coming up, whether those like YIMBY developer-friendly versus there are some folks who feel like those don't really help renters struggling with, how they're going to pay for things right now. Maybe Teri, you can kind of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, we were talking about this a little bit before, which is, there's a renter's credit. So, we've spent a lot of money, a lot of time, as I said, working to put money into the pockets of people who need it. So things like the earned income tax credit, the young child tax credit, refundable tax credits that give people direct cash so that they have both resources and agency to make decisions about their own lives. They're very effective. Like during the pandemic, the expanded child tax credit, dropped childhood poverty by half in a matter of weeks. And so we see what at scale that kind of flexibility can really do for people. So you could think we should maybe do that in the renting scenario as well, in a renter's credit, but our renter's credit's $50. So that's insufficient. And the efforts over the last couple of years to try to resurrect, bring that back up and say, well, maybe we should expand it, just immediately comes crashing into the brick wall of the revenues, right? You have to have the money to do it. And there's so many people who need way more than that it just the cost just becomes so massive right away. So then I think this is so then the next question is, well, how do we pay for things like that? And I think that comes back to the revenues question, which is, are we set up structurally as a state to bring in the right amount of revenue to pay for the things that we want? We want nice things. Why can't we have things? Well, we need to be able to have the kind of incoming revenue dollars to make that real. And so I think that, this might be beyond the scope of this conversation today to go real in depth about it. But of course, there's basically three things. You have income taxes, corporate taxes, and property taxes. And in California, I'm sure you could talk about this all day long. We have, an over-indexing on our income taxes, which is relatively progressive and quite, is if everything else looked like that, we'd probably be in slightly better shape. But with our property taxes being very crimped, I guess would be the way to talk about it, right? They don't move very much. And our corporate taxes being much flatter and much less progressive and having lots of loopholes that let lots of the profits that are generated from the economic growth in the state leave the state or never get captured. We are just always kind of playing with one hand tied behind our back. So I think that is part of the bigger discussion here is there's only so much a state government can do when it doesn't have the dollars to actually address the issues that we're talking about here.
Yeah, the tax piece is, if you want to respond a little bit about that, it's a very interesting, especially, the state's progressive tax is a big, big topic. The wealth tax, obviously that doesn't really factor in with these folks, but the conversation is interesting.
As the state's nonpartisan fiscal advisor, I think that I was talking earlier, and the point that seems critical to me at this juncture is that the state is experiencing what might be once in a generation good revenues, unprecedented revenues, largely as a result of strength in the stock market and the technology companies that call California home. Despite that generationally good position for revenues, we still are looking at a structural out-year deficit for the budget. And that mixed match really causes us some pause about whether the state has a capacity under the current revenue structure to consider changes that would expand spending for assistance of any kind. Or whether the structure itself needs to be reconsidered to sort of allow for those changes. Yeah, that's all I'll say.
Yeah. Do you want to add something?
Well, I was going to sort of grab onto one of the other things that Teri said, which when the Great Recession happened in 2008, I was at the White House at the time, and what we realized, what is obvious to anyone who studies the housing market is it is simply too big for the government to really intercede in any meaningful way. That is a lesson we learned hard during the Great Recession. It is also the dilemma that confronts California government right now. There was nothing, you could try and prop up the lowest income folks, which is a good idea in my opinion, and something that I know Teri works hard on, but to fix the affordability crisis, the housing piece of the affordability crisis in California through government methods is too big of a task, just fiscally. And so you're left sort of leaning on private market solutions to fix the task. And I think that's where a lot of the policy has gone. But it's also just like, I think there's just a revenues or no revenues. There's no amount of California revenues that will turn around the housing market in California without help from developers who need to be building more housing in order to fix this structural housing shortage. So like, that's just a fiscal reality that I think the state has to confront.
Yeah, this kind of leads into my next question with, I guess, housing and maybe housing aside a little bit. Obviously, affordability is like probably the buzzword right now politically, and it's a big discussion for lawmakers. I mean, so much of, you kind of all have talked about this, so much of this is potentially out of their control based on different things happening. But is there any policy, any sort of solution you think that they could pursue to address this crisis, I guess? And I don't know who wants to take that, but maybe not.
I mean, I think to Evan's point that there's no one silver bullet, right?
Yeah.
Like that's why there's 3,500 bills moving through the legislature at this moment in time, right? Like it's making us all crazy. But like that, there's no one thing that is going to be the answer to this problem. Like it was not 1 year in the making, and it's not going to be 1 year in the dismantling. That said, I think that some of the structural problems that we have been that contribute or at least maintain these disparities and kind of keep people kind of locked into the dynamics that Evan's report laid out. I think we need to have like just a really clear-eyed consideration of those structural problems, and really, so it's like, yes, it's like, what can we be doing around incentivizing housing to be built? What can we be doing to, address? So the other side of the house that I work on, we're putting money into the pockets of people who need it. But the other side is like, how do we work to make sure the money stays there, and looking at the forces that actually are trying to pull it out? And so we do a lot of work around corporate concentration and consolidation, and the ways in which the rich have gotten richer, and that's both corporate and individual. But a lot in the case of the corporations, the amassing of kind of power and wealth and increasing ownership share over whether it's housing, whether it's groceries, whether it's healthcare, childcare even, right? Those types of, those economics, and certainly tech, those economic sectors have these kind of just like mega corporations at the center that control the vast majority of the market in most cases. And so they're really kind of like running the tables and creating a structural environment where like any one individual or family or small community can't get out of that, because there's like no escape. And so I think that is a place where government, government can put money into things, but government can also clip the wings of the ability to be able to consolidate and to concentrate in the way that we've seen over the last 30 to 40 years in California and across the country. But I think those are the kinds of things that the government can like bravely and boldly say, like, actually, we're not going to allow this level of concentration because it gives too much power to folks who are, not motivated to, who are following a profit motive, which can be really motivating in good ways, but once it reaches a certain level, actually ends up being very harmful in terms of rising costs, fewer choices, and just and fewer options for employment and workers too.
Yeah. Evan, I don't know if you, after doing this whole study, do you have any thoughts on this?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that I have anything. There's no silver bullet, as Teri said. The one thing that came up for me when doing this report was the difference we saw in terms of student debt, and there are and people are going to ask me which states, and I don't know off the top of my head, but there are other states that offer sort of incentives to stay. Like their sort of anti-brain drain legislation, where they help to repay your student debt if you stay in the state after getting an education there, which we even studied this, so I don't really know the pros and cons to those types of things, but I think it's worth looking into given what we saw in this report. I think, you could imagine those folks also bringing in more revenues over time because of their education levels. And so, it seems like a worthwhile thing to look into in terms of, and just like other policies that think about this retention question seriously. I think it would be worthwhile looking at, and then on the attraction side, I think it's honestly that you could imagine policies that do the same thing in terms of trying to attract entrants. We certainly do that for corporations and businesses when we want them to do business in the state. But I think there's also just kind of a media narrative piece to fight against.
Yeah. Well, I know we want to take some questions from you all, but I just want to give our panelists one more chance. If there's anything else you want to add on this topic, feel free. No? All right. Yeah. Do we have a mic or how are we? A hand.
Sean, can you help run a mic?
Do we have an extra one? Yeah.
Have you compared the data that you have with other states? Because it seems like states like New York, Illinois, which have large cities, comparable with Los Angeles, for example, and San Francisco, might be running into the same issues. So California gets a lot of negative comments. Maybe it's it's unfair. Maybe it just seems like maybe other states are running into the same thing.
I'll answer briefly. We didn't run the full slew of analyses we did on other states, but we do have data across the country and could run most of what we did on other states. Yeah.
Do a report comparing the other states because that
Yeah.
might help alleviate some of the negative comments like California.
Yeah, and I will say, I think it's a good point. And I will say that the changes in migration over the course of the pandemic were across the United States. People were moving out of large urban metros to more rural areas, but in some cases just like smaller urban metros. It wasn't even to like, middle of nowhere kind of places. It was smaller metros like you might see, Chattanooga or things like that. So
Why Tennessee? It's because of the auto industry.
okay,
There's a lot of auto plants in Tennessee.
there you go.
Only to add, one of the things I track is sort of population shifts between urban and rural parts of the country. And since the pandemic, that shift has moved a couple percentage points away from urban and toward rural. And that's regardless of your state line. We've seen that here in California, a movement away from some of the urban centers. Maybe that's pushed by remote work as an availability or hybrid. You only have to be in 1 day a week, so why not move to Shingle Springs, right? To make a Tennessee joke, I have a colleague from Tennessee who recently finished his PhD program there. And he said, when I was moving from Tennessee to California, U-Haul basically gave me the truck because they were just chock full of trucks in Tennessee. So I told him I'd try to get that joke in if I could.
It's like the deadhead. They're deadheading back.
Is it on? There is an old idiom which goes something like this, that human affairs and decisions are driven by twin forces called interest and fear. And I observed that there is lots of emphasis on affordability and housing crisis. So in your study, did you differentiate some of those interests and fears as the driving forces for these kind of decisions by the California population?
So if I understand the question, I think the answer is no, which is to say we don't see people's rationales for leaving. We're able to observe their financial situations and try and draw some conclusions from that, but we don't see their self-reported desire to move. And in fact, lots of these people, if you look at surveys for people who move, very frequently it's for a job or to be closer to family or reasons like that. But then there's the question of once they've made the decision to move, where they move, right? So like I can, go get a job in Pittsburgh, but do I move to the, most, expensive location there, or the, something more affordable, or something I was talking about with Chaz? Do I make the decision to get the same type of house I had in California at a much lower price point, or do I go somewhere in between where I'm getting a bigger house, in my new location, but I'm still paying less in California, but I'm not paying as less as I could, right? So there's all these decisions that I think that conditional on moving, you have to sort of look at. And I think we offer one lens on that, is how I would put it. But I think looking at survey data about why people are moving and getting those stories is another good reason to look at. And I think that might offer more on like sort of the fears and their interests than our report does.
Hi, really interesting study. I'm curious if the data set that you used allowed you to ascertain any of the costs associated with increasing insurance for homeowners or the property tax structure in other states, because here we have, Prop 13 that keeps things kind of artificially low or high depending on who you are and when you buy. So I'm just curious if your data set captures any of those effects, and if it would change, exacerbate or alleviate any of the cost expense when you talk about the savings per month.
Yeah, the short answer to your question is no, we didn't look at that. The slightly longer answer is, on the property tax side, we do hope to look at that, because we are going to be linking these data with property tax assessment data. So stay tuned for that. I do think, when you're looking at the population, the comparison to neighbors, where you see, people are much less likely to be homeowners. And, we were talking backstage before this where, for a new homeowner, their property taxes could be like 50 times what their neighbors are. That's, that for one of these panelists, I'll let you guess who, that is the case, right? And the Chronicle did a great spread, the San Francisco Chronicle did a great spread a couple of years ago about the painted ladies, showing that the property taxes owed by each of the painted ladies is like dramatically different just because of when they, moved into those houses. And I think this fits a broader frame, which is we have a set of policies in California, one of them being Prop 13, another being rent control, another being zoning laws, which preference incumbents over newcomers. And I think there's a big question in my mind as to whether that is actually the people who we think we should be preferencing. And I think people, even people who support rent control, I think you'd be surprised who rent control is benefiting if you look at the population of folks who it's benefiting. So I think that there's real questions in my mind about these incumbency preferences of whether they should be as strong as they are in California. Yeah.
To take incumbency sort of one logical step further, the state currently we have a tax policy called step-up basis in California. So when a wealthy individual passes away, the individuals, usually children or grandchildren, who inherit their assets, those assets are valued for the inheritor at their market value on the day that their parent or grandparent died. So the value gets stepped up. And then if they were to sell those assets in the future, they'd pay capital gains tax, but only on the difference, the smaller difference in the profit. The baby boomers are entering the final sort of stage of their life. I read recently that millennials are expected to inherit something like $50 trillion in assets over the next decade. That's heavily concentrated among the wealthiest families. And one policy option is for the state to reconsider this preferential tax treatment for wealthy individuals who are passing on assets to their children. We don't have a position on that, but we have raised it as an option for the legislature to consider sort of ahead of this large transition of wealth over the next decade or so.
So something that the question I think, Chaz, you raised about would a counterfactual world in which we have 60 million people and we've built more housing, would that be unambiguously better? Kind of brought to mind for me all the friends and acquaintances I have who've moved to places like Austin and San Antonio and Tennessee. And I think of articles that I've seen where they talk about how expensive Austin is now. And it kind of makes me wonder, and I'm wondering if there's if this is a real phenomenon. Like, is there a threshold where at a certain point is California like a victim of its own attractiveness? And like we were ahead of the ahead of the curve in terms of a lot of people coming here, right? That trend line you saw where it's been going up and up and up. And now we sort of hit like a threshold of critical mass. And then now as it's happening in other places like Austin, like at a certain point when there's these big movements of people, things just get expensive and there's only so much housing. Is there something actually in the data too?
I don't want to be glib. There's that quote, you know, when the gods wish to punish us, they answer our prayers. So there's some effect of that. One of the things, it's not a concrete answer to your question, but it's something that I've been noodling. The most recent couple years, we've seen net outmigration of about 150,000 residents. That's actually lower than it was during the home price run-up before the Great Recession. If anything, my sense is that California is even less affordable now than it was then, but maybe compared to the Austins and the Tennessees, maybe it's actually more comparable. And so that balance between California and its sister cities, I don't know what you want to call them, is actually closer now than it's been in the past, because I would expect to see net outmigration higher based purely on home prices. There are a lot of different factors. Yeah, home prices might be the largest one, but there might be some element to that.
That's why I suggested you do a comparison of states and cities.
I don't have an answer to your question, but I have like an adjacent kind of overlay that I'd love for you to do, which is related to job creation. And because so I live in San Francisco, and when I remember the moment where I first realized the whole problem of housing scarcity and like lack of housing in San Francisco is when a local elected was talking about how over the preceding 20 years, for every 8 jobs that we had created, we had only built 1 unit of housing. And I was like, wait. and then like the we there, right? Like who creates the jobs versus who makes the housing? Like those are different parties, and their incentives are not aligned. And so sometimes we have a mismatch there too. So even though you're looking at all of California, like the job growth in San Francisco, like I can't open the paper, read the paper online, without seeing some new company that's going into some new space and is going to be hiring X number of people in San Francisco. And I think like, where are those people going to live, right? And so there's also often like a mismatch there too. So I think that's another thing that's driving some of the, the within California migration. But also, yeah, when you're like, I can't find a place to live that I can afford within proximity enough to the close enough proximity to where my job is. That is a force as well.
I think we have time for one more question. On the question of student debt, did you have any way to control for or kind of understand whether these folks are more likely to have had student debt or just to still have student debt?
So we can see that in the data if they have it from 2004 to present, right? So we can see it in the data. It's not something that we looked at, but it's an interesting question. Yeah. I think we have to break there. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the rest of the panel and the moderator. And feel free to come up with questions after the fact.
Thank
Bye,
you.
all.